I want to sleep with you tonight." After many cold years, the husband turned into a passionate lover. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. A beautiful prayer for you all from Heavenly God. Heavenly Father, bless this beautiful family gathered to hear Mr. Peter's stories. Grant them good health, peace, and joy in their hearts. Forgive their sins and shortcomings, washing them clean with your divine mercy. Guide Mr. Peter as he shares stories that bring wisdom and happiness. Watch over each family member, keeping them safe in your loving embrace. Thank you for bringing us together in this special community. Amen." My sweet family members, when you write present, I feel I am a teacher of school, and you are my beautiful students. Are you present today? And when I call Binta for something, she also says, "Present, sir," with a beautiful smile. My family, a great news for you. I will start a new channel because many people started clone channels with my names, and most of you think they are Mr. Peter. I have just one channel, and I will start a new one. Please suggest me names. Let's start the story. The clinking of silverware against fine china echoed through the cavernous dining room of the Prince estate. Greer Lake Prince sat at one end of the 14-foot mahogany table, her husband Marius at the opposite end, a physical manifestation of the gulf between them. 5 years of marriage, and still they dined with the formality of strangers. Greer cut into her perfectly seared salmon, the knife slicing through with surgical precision. She'd learned to take small, silent bites, to exist without disrupting the air around her. To be invisible was her art form now. "I'll be in Tokyo next week," Marius announced without looking up from his phone, his deep voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. "The Nakamura deal requires my personal attention." "Of course," Greer replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you need me to attend the Foundation Gala on Thursday in your absence?" Marius finally looked up, his steel-grey eyes passing over her as if scanning a piece of furniture. At 38, he was at the height of his power as CEO of Prince Global Investments. The hard angles of his jaw and cheekbones caught the light from the crystal chandelier above them, highlighting a face that graced business magazines but rarely turned toward his wife with any warmth. "No," he said flatly. "Thaddeus can represent the family interests. There's no need for you to be there. There's no need for you anywhere." The unspoken message hung between them. Greer nodded, swallowing the familiar sting of dismissal. At 32, she had spent 5 years perfecting the art of not reacting, of accepting her place in this bargain they called marriage. "As you wish," she murmured. Vasquez, their house manager, entered silently to clear their plates. His eyes flickered sympathetically toward Greer before resuming his professional detachment. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Prince?" "Bring the Macallan to my study," Marius commanded, standing abruptly. He adjusted his custom-tailored shirt cuffs, a nervous habit that betrayed the only crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade. "I have calls until midnight." He left without another word to Greer, his footsteps fading down the marble hallway of their Westchester County mansion. The 30,000-square-foot home had never felt warm, not even in the height of summer. Its stark white walls and minimalist decor, Marius's choice, not hers, only amplified the emotional vacuum inside. When Vasquez returned, Greer was still sitting motionless, staring at the space her husband had occupied. "Mrs. Prince," he said gently, "would you like your tea in the solarium tonight?" Greer's lips curved into what passed for a smile these days. "Thank you, Vasquez, but I think I'll retire early." The older man hesitated. "If I may, Mrs. Prince, it's a beautiful evening. Perhaps some fresh air would be pleasant before bed?" His kindness nearly broke her. In a house full of staff who maintained Marius's preferred distance, Vasquez alone, seemed to see her fading away day by day. "Perhaps tomorrow," she replied, rising from the table with practiced grace. Upstairs, in her separate bedroom suite, Greer stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds. The moon cast silver light across the reflecting pool, creating an otherworldly scene that matched her sense of displacement. She let her gaze drift to the framed photograph on her nightstand, the only personal touch in the sterile room. In it, her parents beamed proudly on their front porch in South Side Chicago, their arms around a younger Greer in a graduation cap and gown. They'd been gone for 6 years now, killed in the same plane crash that had left her orphaned and nearly destitute at 26. The path from that devastated girl to Marius Prince's unwanted wife had been short and brutal. Her parents' medical debts and the discovery that their insurance policy had lapsed had left her with nothing but crushing responsibility. When Octavia Prince, Marius's formidable mother, had proposed the arrangement, Greer had been too broken to refuse. "My son needs a wife of appropriate background to satisfy the board before his ascension to CEO," Octavia had stated clinically over tea in her Manhattan penthouse. "You need financial security and the clearance of your parents' debts. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement, Miss Lake." What Octavia hadn't mentioned was that Greer would be replacing Valencia Montenegro, the fiery socialite who had left Marius at the altar 3 weeks before their wedding, the woman he had actually loved. The intercom beside Greer's bed buzzed, startling her from her memories. "Yes," she answered. "Mrs. Prince, your mother-in-law is on line 1, came the voice of the night assistant. Greer suppressed a sigh. "Put her through, please." The phone rang once before Octavia Prince's commanding voice filled the room. "Greer, I've just heard from Kingsley at Vogue that you declined their profile piece for the power couples issue." No greeting, no pleasantries. Octavia never wasted time on social niceties she deemed unnecessary. "Good evening, Octavia," Greer replied, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I declined because Marius has made it clear he doesn't want media attention on our personal lives." "Nonsense! This is exactly the type of press coverage we need before the Hudson River development announcement. The board responds well to the stability you represent. A prop, a cardboard cutout to stand beside him for photographs." "I'll speak to Marius about it," Greer conceded, knowing she would do no such thing. "See that you do," Octavia said sharply. "And Greer? The Beaumont charity auction is next month. I've taken the liberty of having Emmeline select appropriate gowns for you to consider. She'll bring them by tomorrow." "That's not necessary." "It is entirely necessary. Your appearance reflects on the Prince name. We can't have a repeat of the Symphony Gala. That dress was entirely too modest. People were whispering." Too modest. Not too revealing. Too modest. Even her attempts to fade into the background were failures in Octavia's eyes. "I understand," Greer said tonelessly. "Good. Marius mentioned Tokyo next week. You'll use the time to prepare for the legislators' dinner. Senator Whitmore will be there, and his support on the zoning commission is crucial." The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Greer clutching the phone in a white-knuckled grip. This was her life, being deployed like a strategic asset without agency or voice. She moved to her bathroom, the Italian marble cold beneath her bare feet. The woman who stared back from the mirror was a stranger, a pale, too-thin ghost with dull eyes and shoulder-length hair, styled in the conservative cut Octavia had suggested was appropriate for a Prince wife. For the first time in years, Greer really looked at herself. There was nothing left of the vibrant girl from the South Side who had earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, who had danced until dawn at underground clubs, whose laugh had turned heads and whose dreams had seemed limitless. "This is what happens when you let yourself disappear," she thought, pressing her palm against the cool glass. You become exactly what they want. Nothing at all. The tears that threatened to fall remained unshed. Greer Lake Prince did not cry. Not anymore. She had learned that lesson during the first year of her marriage, when Marius had walked in on her sobbing in their shared sitting room. "I did not sign up for emotional displays," he had said coldly. "If you find our arrangement unsatisfactory, perhaps we should reconsider the terms." The threat had been clear. Without this marriage, she would lose everything: the financial security, her parents' debts settled, the charitable foundation she had established in their memory. So she had swallowed her tears and promised there would be no more displays. Greer turned away from her reflection and mechanically prepared for bed, applying expensive creams and serums that were delivered monthly without her requesting them. Another aspect of her life controlled by the Prince machine. As she slipped between the silken sheets, her phone buzzed with a text. Reaching for it, she was surprised to see the name of Zora Washington, her childhood friend and the only connection to her past that she had maintained despite Octavia's disapproval. "Hey, stranger. Been thinking about you. Drinks tomorrow? Got some news you need to hear in person. The usual spot, 7 p.m. Greer hesitated. Marius would be in meetings all evening, and Octavia's spies, because she was certain the older woman had them, wouldn't follow her to the small jazz club in Harlem where she occasionally met Zora. "I'll be there," she typed back, feeling a flicker of something long dormant, anticipation perhaps, or rebellion. She set the phone down and closed her eyes, listening to the silence of her beautiful prison. 5 years. 5 cold years of being nothing but a contract, an obligation, a box checked on Marius Prince's path to empire. Tomorrow, she decided as sleep began to claim her, she would wear the red dress hidden at the back of her closet, the one Octavia didn't know about, the one that reminded her of who she had been before, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to remember what it felt like to be seen. Across the mansion, in his study, Marius Prince swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler and stared unseeing at the quarterly reports on his desk. Valencia's face flashed in his mind, her cinnamon eyes alight with passion as she told him she couldn't go through with their wedding. "You don't love me, Marius," she had said. "You love the idea of me, the challenge, but you don't see me. Not really." He had replaced her within a month, a business transaction executed with the same precision as his corporate acquisitions. Greer Lake had been the perfect candidate, educated, beautiful in a subdued way, desperate enough to accept his terms without complaint. For 5 years he had kept his end of the bargain: financial security, social position, the veneer of a marriage. But never his heart, never his attention. Those had been buried with his feelings for Valencia, locked away where they couldn't interfere with what mattered: power, control, success. He didn't hate Greer. He simply felt nothing at all when he looked at her, which was rarely and never for long. She was furniture in his life, a necessary accessory that faded into the background of more important matters. And that, Marius Prince told himself as he drained his glass, was exactly how things would remain. Chapter 2. Metamorphosis. "You look like shit," Zora Washington declared, setting down 2 martinis on the small table tucked into the corner of Blue Note, the jazz club where Greer had been meeting her oldest friend for years. Greer's lips quirked into something resembling a smile. "Hello to you too." "I'm serious, G." Zora slid into the seat across from her, dark eyes appraising. As a top fashion photographer, Zora had an eye for detail that missed nothing. "You've lost more weight. Your skin's dull. And your eyes—" She shook her head. "Girl, your eyes look dead." The truth landed like a physical blow. Greer reached for her martini, the red dress she'd rebelliously worn, suddenly feeling like a costume rather than the statement she'd intended. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the lie practiced to perfection. "Bullshit." Zora leaned forward, her voice dropping. "What's that bastard doing to you?" "Marius isn't doing anything to me," Greer sighed. "That's rather the point. He doesn't do anything, doesn't say anything, doesn't see anything. I simply exist in his peripheral vision. So leave him." The suggestion hung between them, dangerous and impossible. Greer swirled the olive in her drink. "You know I can't." "Can't or won't," Zora challenged. "The Greer Lake I grew up with wouldn't have let any man, no matter how rich or powerful, turn her into a ghost." The band started playing, a smoky rendition of "I Put a Spell on You" that seemed to wrap around Greer's throat, making it hard to breathe. "You said you had news," she deflected. Zora's expression shifted from confrontational to excited. "I got the Vogue contract. 3 spreads, complete creative control, and a 6-figure payday." She reached across the table to squeeze Greer's hand. "And I want you to be my legal advisor on the deal." "Me?" Greer blinked in surprise. "But I haven't practiced law in 5 years. "So? You graduated top of your class from Northwestern. You passed the bar in 3 states. Your brain didn't stop working just because you married into the Prince Empire." Zora's gaze was unflinching. "Unless you've let that part of yourself die too." The words hit with surgical precision, cutting through the layers of numbness Greer had carefully constructed around herself. "I wouldn't even know where to begin," she whispered. "Yes, you would." Zora pulled a thick folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "The contract's in there. Look it over. I don't trust those Manhattan sharks, but I trust you." Before Greer could protest further, Zora signaled the waitress for another round. "Now about that makeover." "What makeover?" Greer asked warily. "The one you're getting, starting tomorrow." Zora's tone brooked no argument. "I've booked you at Dario's gym. He's a miracle worker who trains half of Broadway and the other half of the Victoria's Secret runway. You're going 5 days a week. Zora, I can't just—" "You can, and you will," her friend cut her off. "I'm also taking you to Marcel for a complete hair overhaul. Those soccer mum layers are criminal." "Octavia selected this hairstyle," Greer said defensively. "She thought it was appropriate for a 60-year-old society matron, maybe." Zora rolled her eyes. "Octavia Prince is turning you into her personal Stepford wife, and you're letting her." The second martini arrived, and Greer took a gulp, feeling the alcohol burn down her throat. When was the last time she'd had more than a polite sip of wine at a charity function? When was the last time she'd felt anything burn? "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Zora's expression softened. "Because I miss my friend, the real Greer Lake, fierce, brilliant, unstoppable. The girl who destroyed the debate team at Whitney Young, who got into Northwestern on pure talent when the rest of us could only dream. The woman who wasn't afraid of anything." "She's gone," Greer whispered. "No." Zora shook her head firmly. "She's buried, and it's time to dig her up." 3 weeks later, Greer stood in Dario Rodriguez's private gym, sweat dripping down her face as she punched the heavy bag with everything she had. "Harder!" Dario commanded, his muscular arms crossed over his chest. "You're not at some society tea party. Hit it like you mean it." Greer gritted her teeth and drove her fist into the bag again, the impact jarring up her arm. The pain felt clarifying, awakening nerve endings long dormant. "That's it," Dario nodded approvingly. "Now imagine it's someone who hurt you, who made you feel small." Unbidden, Octavia Prince's imperious face flashed in Greer's mind. Then Marius's indifferent profile. With a visceral cry she didn't recognize as her own, Greer unleashed a series of blows that sent the bag swinging wildly. "Time," Dario called, looking impressed. "Not bad for a society princess. We'll make a warrior out of you yet." Gasping for breath, Greer sank onto a nearby bench. Her muscles screamed in protest, a delicious, unfamiliar ache that proved she was alive, that she still had a body capable of strength. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, surprising herself. Dario's eyebrows shot up. "I thought 3 times a week was all your schedule allowed." "Things change," Greer replied, reaching for her water bottle. "I want to come every day. Your body will hate you." "My body and I need to get reacquainted anyway." For the first time in years, Greer returned to the Prince mansion feeling something other than resignation. Her skin tingled with endorphins, her mind clearer than it had been in months. She slipped in through the side entrance, hoping to avoid Vasquez or any of the other staff who might report her disheveled state to Octavia. The last thing she needed was her mother-in-law questioning why the proper Mrs. Prince was sweating like a common laborer. Making it to her suite undetected, Greer stripped off her workout clothes and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water sluice over muscles that already felt different, harder, more alive. As steam filled the bathroom, she made a decision. Reaching for her phone, she called Zora. "That tattoo artist you mentioned," she said without preamble. "Is he available this weekend?" Zora's delighted laugh was answer enough. By the 2-month mark, Greer barely recognized herself in the mirror. Dario's punishing regimen had transformed her body, replacing frail thinness with lean muscle. Her collarbones still stood out, but now they framed strong shoulders and arms defined by countless hours of weight training. Her hair, once a mousy shoulder-length bob, now cascaded down her back in glossy dark waves, the ends dipped in a subtle blue that caught the light when she moved. It was a small rebellion, easily hidden in a chignon for formal events, but it made her smile every time she glimpsed it. And then there were the tattoos. The first one had been modest, a small phoenix on her inner wrist, easily covered by the expensive watches Marius had given her as impersonal birthday gifts over the years. But as her confidence grew, so did her boldness. Now, a magnificent dragon curved along her ribcage, its tail wrapping around to her back, where delicate cherry blossoms scattered across her shoulder blade. They told a story only she understood, of destruction and rebirth, of strength forged in fire. She had expected to feel guilty, to worry about discovery. Instead, each change, each deliberate reclaiming of her body, felt like coming home to herself. Her wardrobe evolved too. Gone were the conservative St. John's suits and modest Carolina Herrera dresses that Octavia approved. In their place, Greer began selecting pieces that showcased her new physique. Still elegant, but with an edge that made heads turn. Even Vasquez had noticed, his eyes widening appreciatively when she'd descended the stairs in a form-fitting black dress with a daring cutout that revealed just a hint of the dragon's tail along her side. "Mrs. Prince," he'd said, recovering quickly, "you look different." "Thank you, Vasquez," she'd replied with a genuine smile. "I feel different." The Prince Technologies charity gala had been her first public appearance since beginning her transformation. She'd chosen a dark emerald gown that clung to every new curve, its high collar a deceptively modest contrast to the entirely backless design. With her hair swept up, the cherry blossoms across her shoulder were impossible to miss. The collective gasp when she'd entered the ballroom had been worth every punishing hour in Dario's gym, every moment of pain under the tattoo needle. Octavia had been livid, her face a frozen mask of displeasure as she'd cornered Greer by the ladies' room. "What do you think you're doing?" she'd hissed. "Those vulgar markings are visible to everyone." The Whitmore Foundation director nearly swallowed his tongue. "Good," Greer had replied calmly. "Perhaps it will give him something to think about besides offshore tax havens." "This behavior is unacceptable. What will Marius say?" The question had hung between them, almost comical in its absurdity. Marius barely spoke to her at all. He had been in Tokyo for the past 2 weeks, then straight to London without so much as a phone call. "I don't particularly care what Marius says," Greer had answered, surprising herself with the truth of it. The prince's name has had use of my body for 5 years. I'm reclaiming it. She'd walked away then, leaving Octavia sputtering in shock. The surge of power she'd felt had been intoxicating, as had the admiring glances from men who would never have looked twice at the invisible woman she'd been before. For the first time, Greer understood that her cage had been partially of her own making. She had accepted the terms of her imprisonment so completely that she'd stopped testing the bars. Now, standing in her bedroom as she prepared for the governor's ball, an event Marius would actually attend, having returned from Europe yesterday, Greer contemplated her reflection with critical eyes. The woman who gazed back was a revelation, confident, strong, her eyes no longer dull but alive with purpose. She had rewritten herself physically. It remained to be seen if she could rewrite her future as well. The dress she'd chosen for tonight was her most daring yet, a blood-red silk that moved like water, cut to accentuate every curve Dario had helped her sculpt. The halter neckline drew attention to her toned shoulders and arms, while the low back would reveal the full glory of her cherry blossom tattoo. "Mrs. Prince," came Vasquez's voice through the intercom. "The car will be ready in 15 minutes. Mr. Prince asks that you meet him in the foyer." Asks, not demands. Interesting. "Thank you, Vasquez. I'll be down shortly." Greer applied a final coat of red lipstick, the same shade as her dress. War paint, Zora had called it. Tonight would be the first time she and Marius had been in the same room for more than 5 minutes in over 2 months. The first time he would see the new Greer Lake Prince. She slipped into her Louboutins, enjoying the extra height they gave her. Taking a deep breath, she headed for the door, her heart racing with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Marius Prince prided himself on his control. Control of his business empire, control of his emotions, control of his reactions. It was a quality that had served him well in the ruthless world of high finance and corporate takeovers. But when his wife of 5 years descended the grand staircase of their home, control became a distant memory. He didn't recognize her at first. This couldn't be Greer, this warrior goddess in red silk, moving with the confidence of a woman who knew her own power. His Greer was quiet, faded, a presence easily overlooked. This woman commanded attention. Her body, once frail to the point of concern, not that he'd expressed it, now curved in ways that made his mouth go dry. Muscle definition showed in her arms and shoulders, still feminine, but undeniably strong. And then there were the tattoos, intricate artwork curved across skin that had once been a blank canvas. When had this happened? How had he not noticed? "You're staring, Marius," she said, her voice lower and more confident than he remembered. "Is something wrong?" He cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "Your back is exposed. The tattoo is inappropriate for the governor's ball." She raised an eyebrow, unintimidated. "The governor's wife has a full sleeve of tattoos herself. I doubt she'll be scandalized." "My mother will be there, and won't that be interesting?" Greer smiled, a predatory curl of lips that he'd never seen before. "Shall we go?" "We wouldn't want to be late." Without waiting for his response, without seeking his approval as she always had before, she swept past him toward the door. The scent of her perfume, something new and intoxicating, lingered in her wake. Marius followed, off balance in a way he hadn't experienced since Valencia had walked out on him all those years ago. Throughout their marriage, he had maintained careful distance from Greer, seeing her as nothing more than a necessary component of his public image. Now, as he watched other men's eyes follow his wife as she entered the ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, something unfamiliar and dangerous stirred in his chest. Desire, jealousy, possession. All evening, heads turned as Greer moved through the crowd. She spoke with animation to senators and business leaders who had previously overlooked her. She laughed. When had he last heard her laugh? And the sound drew attention from across the room. "Your wife is quite transformed," remarked Howard Whitmore, sliding up beside Marius at the bar. "Barely recognized her. She was always a beauty, of course, but now—" The older man let out a low whistle. "She's magnificent." Marius's hand tightened around his scotch glass. "Indeed." "Lucky man," Whitmore continued, oblivious to the tension radiating from Marius. "Half the men here are wondering how a cold fish like you managed to land a woman like that." The casual insult struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Marius had been a cold fish, deliberately so. He had married Greer as a business arrangement, never intending to develop feelings, never risking the vulnerability that came with emotional connection. Yet now, watching her accept an invitation to dance from Ricardo Vega, a notorious playboy with a string of broken engagements behind him, Marius felt something crack in his carefully constructed armor. Without conscious thought, he set down his drink and cut across the dance floor, inserting himself between Vega and his wife with barely concealed aggression. "I believe this dance belongs to me," he said, his voice arctic. Vega raised his hands in mock surrender. "Of course, Prince. Just keeping the lady entertained." He turned to Greer with a wink. "Until next time, beautiful." Marius's arm slid around Greer's waist, pulling her against him with uncharacteristic possessiveness. Her eyes widened slightly, but she allowed him to lead her into the dance, her body moving with newfound grace against his. "I wasn't aware you enjoyed dancing," she observed, the subtle scent of her perfume making it difficult for him to concentrate. "In 5 years, you've never once asked me." The accusation was subtle but unmistakable. Had he really never danced with his own wife, even at their wedding? Memory flickered. A perfunctory first dance, performed like a duty, his mind on the Thompson merger rather than the woman in his arms. He had treated their marriage like a business transaction from the very beginning. "You've changed," he said, instead of addressing her point. "Yes." No explanation, no apology. Just a simple acknowledgement of the obvious. "Why?" Her laugh was low and musical. "Why not? Did you imagine I would continue to fade away until I disappeared entirely? I never wanted you to—" "You never wanted me at all," she interrupted, her voice soft but edged with steel. "Let's not pretend otherwise, Marius. We both know why this marriage exists." The music swelled around them, forcing them closer together. He could feel the heat of her body through the red silk, could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat. Had she always been this alive, this vibrant, or had he simply refused to see it? "The contract didn't include transformation," he said, immediately regretting the coldness of his words. "The contract didn't include a lot of things," Greer replied, her eyes locked with his. "It didn't include fulfillment, or respect, or the slightest scrap of affection." Her smile was sad. "But I've stopped expecting those things from you." Before he could respond, the music ended. Greer stepped back from his embrace, the absence of her warmth leaving him unexpectedly bereft. "If you'll excuse me," she said politely. "Governor Holloway's wife wanted to discuss a literacy program I'm developing for underserved communities." She walked away, leaving Marius staring after her with the disconcerting sense that something valuable had slipped through his fingers, something he hadn't even known he wanted until now. For the rest of the evening, he found himself watching her, the confident tilt of her chin, the elegant line of her neck, the way men gravitated toward her like moths to flame. Some primal part of him wanted to stake his claim, to remind everyone, including Greer herself, that she was his wife. But was she? In any real sense? He had kept her at arm's length for 5 years, treating their marriage as nothing more than a convenient arrangement. He had no right to the jealousy coursing through him now, no claim to the stunning woman commanding attention across the ballroom. By the time they returned home, tension thrummed between them like a live wire. Greer kicked off her heels in the foyer, a casual gesture that seemed shockingly intimate after years of careful distance. "Quite an evening," she said, rolling her shoulders to ease the strain of hours in the fitted gown. The movement drew his eyes to the tattoo sprawling across her back, delicate cherry blossoms that seemed to cascade down her skin. Without thinking, Marius reached out, his fingers hovering just above the inked petals. "When did you get this?" Greer went still, her breath catching audibly. 6 weeks ago, she answered, not moving away from his almost touch. "Does it bother you?" "It's beautiful, unexpected, defiant, different." She turned to face him, the movement bringing his hand to rest against her bare shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her skin in... he couldn't remember how long. "Different seems to be my specialty lately." Her eyes met his, challenging. "Though you'd have to be paying attention to notice." The accusation lingered between them, undeniable in its truth. He hadn't paid attention, not to her accomplishments with the foundation that bore his family's name, but ran on her efforts, not to her volunteer work at the literacy center in Brooklyn, not to her gradual disappearance as Octavia molded her into the perfect prince wife. "I'm noticing now," he said quietly. Something flashed in her eyes, vulnerability quickly masked by the cool confidence she'd displayed all evening. Too little, too late. She stepped back, breaking the fragile connection between them. "Good night, Marius." He watched her climb the stairs, the red dress flowing behind her like a river of blood. Blood he had drawn with years of indifference, with the slow death of 1,000 cuts called neglect. For the first time in their marriage, Marius Prince felt something stir in his chest as he watched his wife walk away. Regret. Chapter 3. Battlefield of Desire. 3 months had passed since Greer's transformation began, and the Prince Mansion had become a battlefield of tension and unspoken desire. Marius found himself coming home earlier, abandoning late meetings that once seemed so crucial. He would invent reasons to be in rooms where Greer might appear, pretending to review documents in the sunroom when he knew she took her morning coffee there, lingering in the library during the evening hours she preferred to read. Yet whenever they occupied the same space, conversation eluded them. 5 years of practiced distance had created a chasm neither knew how to bridge. Greer noticed his new habits, but refused to make it easy for him. If he entered a room, she would acknowledge him with cool politeness before continuing whatever she was doing. If he attempted small talk, she responded with minimal engagement. His sudden interest felt too little, too late. Tonight, Greer stood in the kitchen at midnight, her workout clothes clinging to her sweat-dampened body. Dario had pushed her particularly hard, and every muscle hummed with pleasant exhaustion. She reached for a bottle of water, unaware of Marius watching from the doorway. "You're up late," he said, startling her. Greer turned, one hand pressed to her chest. "I didn't hear you." Marius's eyes traced the defined lines of her arms, the curve of her waist, where her cropped top revealed a strip of toned stomach. "Where were you?" The question bordered on possessive. In 5 years, he'd never once asked about her whereabouts. "The gym," she replied, taking a deliberate sip of water. "At midnight? Dario keeps it open late for clients who prefer privacy." "Dario," Marius repeated, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "Your trainer?" Greer raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Marius, my trainer, the person responsible for this." She gestured to her transformed body with unmistakable pride. He moved closer, drawn by some force he couldn't name. "And what else is he responsible for?" The implication hung between them, shocking them both. In 5 years of marriage, jealousy had never entered their equation, not because of trust, but because of indifference. That's none of your business, Greer said quietly. You're my wife. A humorless laugh escaped her. Am I? Strange time to remember that particular detail. Marius stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. I've always known you were my wife. Knowing and caring are different things, she countered, refusing to back away despite his proximity. You've never cared before. And if I care now? The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither had considered in years. Greer's breath caught, but she kept her expression neutral. Then you're 5 years too late. She attempted to move past him, but Marius caught her wrist, his fingers brushing against the small phoenix tattoo hidden there. When did you get this? He asked, his voice rougher than intended. 2 months ago, she answered, not pulling away despite the urge to do so. You never noticed. His thumb traced the delicate lines of the phoenix, the intimacy of the gesture sending shivers up her arm. I'm noticing now. That seems to be your new catchphrase. Greer gently extracted her wrist from his grasp. Good night, Marius. As she walked away, Marius called after her. The Villand reception is tomorrow night. She paused at the doorway. I'm aware. Will you be my date? The formal question, asked with uncharacteristic uncertainty, hung in the air between them. In 5 years, they had attended countless events together, but always as obligatory companions, never as willing partners. I'll be there, Greer answered without turning. Whether I'm yours remains to be seen. The Villand reception was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with New York's elite gathered among ancient artifacts and priceless paintings. For once, Marius arrived early, standing at the entrance with uncharacteristic impatience as he waited for his wife. When Greer appeared, the air left his lungs in a rush. She wore a gown of midnight blue that clung to every curve before flowing into a dramatic train. Her back was fully exposed, revealing the dragon tattoo that curved around her ribs and the cherry blossoms scattered across her shoulder blades. But it was her confidence that truly arrested him, the way she held herself like a queen who needed no crown to command attention. You look... Words failed him for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Thank you, she replied with a slight smile, rescuing him from his uncharacteristic speechlessness. Shall we? Throughout the evening, Marius found himself distracted, his legendary focus shattered by the woman at his side. She spoke intelligently with museum benefactors, laughed genuinely with artists whose work was featured in the new exhibit, and garnered admiring glances from men who would have previously overlooked her. Your wife is remarkable, commented Eloise Villand, the evening's hostess. I had no idea she was so knowledgeable about contemporary art. Marius managed a nod, watching as Greer engaged in animated conversation with a renowned sculptor. Neither did I, he admitted. The realization struck him with unexpected force. There was so much about his own wife he didn't know. Interests, passions, talents that had remained hidden beneath the quiet compliance he had demanded of their arrangement. Later, as they danced, Marius found himself holding her closer than propriety required, one hand splayed against the bare skin of her back. Everyone is watching us, Greer murmured, her breath warm against his ear. Let them watch, he replied, surprising himself with the possessiveness in his tone. She pulled back slightly to study his face. What game are you playing, Marius? No game. His fingers traced the edge of a tattooed cherry blossom on her shoulder. I simply want to dance with my wife. You've never wanted that before. Her directness was new, another transformation he was still adjusting to. The Greer of 6 months ago would have accepted his attention without question, grateful for any scrap of recognition. Things change. He echoed her words from their previous encounter, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Do they? Or do you simply want what others now desire? The accusation hit with uncomfortable accuracy. Marius's jaw tightened, but he couldn't deny the truth in her question. It had taken the admiring glances of other men to make him truly see the woman he had married. "Perhaps I was blind before," he conceded, surprising them both with the admission. Greer's expression softened momentarily before the shield went back up. "Convenient timing for your vision to clear." The song ended, and she stepped out of his embrace with practiced grace. "I need some air." Without waiting for his response, she made her way toward one of the balconies overlooking Central Park. Marius watched her go, desire and confusion warring within him. He had married Greer as a business arrangement, never intending to develop feelings, never risking the vulnerability that came with emotional connection. Now, watching other men's eyes follow her retreating figure, he felt something primal and possessive stir in his chest. Following an impulse he would have dismissed as weakness 6 months ago, Marius went after her. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the crowded gallery. Greer stood alone at the stone balustrade, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the city below. She looked like a painting herself, all elegant lines and haunting beauty. "You left rather abruptly," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I needed space." "From the party or from me?" Her laugh held no humor. "Both, perhaps." Silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken tensions and newly awakened desires. "What happened to us, Greer?" he asked finally. She turned to face him fully, surprise evident in her expression. "Nothing happened to us, Marius. Nothing was ever allowed to happen. You married me because you needed a wife to complete your corporate image. I married you because I was desperate and grieving." Her voice remained steady despite the brutal honesty of her words. "We've been strangers sharing a house for 5 years. And now? She shook her head slightly. "Now I'm no longer content to be invisible. I'm reclaiming the woman I was before life, and your family ground her down to nothing." The raw truth of her statement struck him with unexpected force. He had taken this vibrant, intelligent woman, and through neglect and indifference, nearly extinguished her light. "And is there room in this reclamation for me?" he asked, the question emerging unbidden. Greer studied him, wariness evident in her gaze. "Why would you want there to be? You've never wanted me before." "I want you now." The admission escaped before he could censor it, hanging in the air between them. Her eyes widened fractionally before narrowing with suspicion. "You want what you suddenly fear losing. It's not the same thing." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, taking a step toward her. "But does the reason matter if the result is the same?" "It matters to me," she replied, standing her ground despite his proximity. "I won't be a prize you suddenly value because others have noticed its worth." Marius reached out, his fingers grazing the curve of her cheek in a touch so gentle it seemed at odds with the hard man he had always presented himself to be. "What if I told you I'm seeing you, truly seeing you for the first time?" he asked, voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I'd say you have terrible timing," Greer answered, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "And that seeing isn't the same as knowing." His hand dropped to his side. "Then let me know you, Greer. The real you." "Why?" The question was simple but loaded with 5 years of neglect and indifference. "Why now, Marius?" He had no answer that wouldn't expose vulnerabilities he had spent a lifetime guarding. Instead, he closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face with unexpected tenderness. "May I?" he asked, gaze dropping to her lips. For a heartbeat she seemed to soften, to lean imperceptibly toward him. Then, with visible effort, she pulled back. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to rewrite 5 years of indifference with one kiss, Marius." She stepped around him, her composure remarkable despite the charged moment they had just shared. "I'll be taking a separate car home." she informed him, all business once more. "Don't wait up." As she walked away, Marius felt something unfamiliar crack open in his chest, the first fissure in the ice that had encased his heart for years. The battle for Greer's heart had begun, and for the first time in his life, Marius Prince wasn't certain of victory. Chapter 4. Desperate Measures. 2 weeks had passed since the villain reception, 2 weeks of escalating tension within the Prince mansion. Marius found himself in unfamiliar territory, pursuing a woman who showed no interest in being caught. For the first time in his life, his considerable resources and power seemed inadequate to the task at hand. He sent flowers, arrangements so lavish they required 2 delivery men to carry them. Greer thanked him politely and donated them to the children's hospital the next day. He had his assistant clear his schedule for a weekend, suggesting they fly to Paris on a whim. Greer declined, citing prior commitments with her literacy program in Brooklyn. He even resorted to leaving a blue Tiffany box containing a diamond necklace worth more than most people's homes on her pillow. The box reappeared on his desk the following morning, unopened, with a note, "I don't need more jewelry I'll never wear." Marius Prince wasn't accustomed to failure. In business, he identified what he wanted and acquired it, regardless of obstacles. But Greer remained elusive, physically present yet emotionally unreachable. Tonight, he waited in the dimly lit kitchen, knowing she would return late from her gym session with Dario. The knowledge that she spent hours with the muscular trainer still twisted something unpleasant in his gut, a feeling he refused to identify as jealousy. When she entered, flushed and glowing from exertion, he straightened from his casual lean against the counter. "You're up late," Greer observed, echoing his words from weeks before. "I wanted to see you," he replied simply. She reached past him for a bottle of water, her body close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "Here I am. Have dinner with me tomorrow. I have plans. Cancel them." The words emerged sharper than intended, an order rather than a request. Greer's eyebrow arched. "No!" The simple refusal stunned him. Throughout their marriage, she had accommodated his schedule without question, rearranging her life to fit into the corners he left for her. "What plans?" he demanded, immediately regretting his tone. "Not that it's your concern, but I'm launching a new literacy initiative with Zora. We're hosting a fundraising dinner at Le Bernardin. I could donate whatever amount you need," he offered. "Free you up to spend the evening with me instead." Her laugh was genuine, but lacked warmth. "Throwing money at me won't work, Marius. My foundation isn't for sale, and neither am I." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She studied him, her expression unreadable. "You've spent your life believing everything has a price, that enough money or power can obtain whatever you desire." "Not everything," he admitted quietly. Something in his tone made her pause, her defensive posture softening slightly. "Why this sudden interest, Marius?" What changed? The question demanded a vulnerability he wasn't prepared to offer. Instead, he countered with another question. "Why did you stay? 5 years of a marriage in name only. Why didn't you leave?" Greer's expression shuttered. "You know why. The foundation for my parents' memory, the debts, the legal battle would have destroyed what little I had left." "And now," he persisted, "you've established yourself. The foundation is successful. You could leave." She looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe I'm considering it." The possibility hit him with unexpected force. Throughout their cold marriage, divorce had never been discussed. The arrangement benefited them both too much to disrupt it. But now, with Greer's transformation and newfound independence, the equation had changed. "I don't want you to go," he said, the admission costing him more than she could know. "What you want stopped being my priority a long time ago." She moved toward the door, clearly ending the conversation. "Good night, Marius." As she walked away, he called after her, "I'll be at your fundraiser tomorrow night." She paused, turning to face him with surprise. "As what?" "As your husband," he answered, "and as a donor." Suspicion clouded her features. "Why?" "Because it matters to you," he replied, surprising them both with his sincerity. For the first time in weeks, Greer's expression softened with something close to warmth. "Thank you," she said simply, before disappearing up the stairs. Marius stood alone in the kitchen, feeling as though he'd finally won a small but significant victory. Le Bernardin glittered with New York's elite, not the usual corporate titans and socialites of Marius's world, but artists, writers, educators, and advocates drawn by Greer and Zora's vision of literacy programs for underserved communities. Marius stood at the edge of the crowd, observing his wife in her element. She moved through the room with graceful confidence, her passion evident as she described the initiative to potential donors. The black jumpsuit she wore was elegant but understated, allowing her ideas, rather than her appearance, to command attention. "Well, well," came a familiar voice beside him, the Ice King himself, mingling with the commoners. He turned to find Zora Washington regarding him with open skepticism. "Zora," he acknowledged with a nod. "It's been a while." "5 years, give or take," she replied coolly. "Funny how you only started showing up when Greer stopped fading into the background." Her directness was refreshing after years of people deferring to him out of fear or ambition. "You've always spoken your mind. Someone needs to." She sipped her champagne, eyes never leaving his face. "What's your game, Prince? Suddenly playing the devoted husband after years of treating her like furniture." "It's not a game." "Everything's a game to men like you," Zora countered. "Life's just a series of acquisitions and power plays, but Greer isn't a company you can buy when its stock becomes valuable." The accuracy of her assessment stung more than he cared to admit. "You don't know me." "I know what you did to my best friend," she replied, voice low with contained anger. "I watched her disappear a little more every day for 5 years, trying to be what you and your mother wanted. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" Before he could respond, Greer appeared at Zora's side, her smile faltering slightly when she saw them together. "Everything okay here?" she asked, eyes moving between them. "Perfect," Zora assured her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just getting reacquainted with your husband." She squeezed Greer's arm. "I need to check on the auction items. Don't let him write a check big enough to buy your forgiveness." With that parting shot, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. "She's protective," Greer said finally. "With good reason, apparently," Marius replied, surprising her with the admission. "She seems to think I've treated you badly." "Haven't you?" The simple question, asked without accusation, struck him with unexpected force. Had he treated her badly? By his estimation, he had fulfilled the terms of their arrangement. Financial security, social position, freedom to pursue her foundation work. But he had never considered what she might need beyond those terms, had never considered her emotional needs at all. "Yes," he admitted finally, "though not intentionally." "Does that make it better or worse?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her tone. Before he could answer, they were interrupted by the evening's MC announcing dinner. Greer was whisked away to the head table, leaving Marius to contemplate her question throughout the meal. The fundraiser was impressively organized, raising over $2 million for the literacy initiative. Marius contributed a substantial sum, but took care to do so without fanfare, sensing that a public display would only reinforce Zora's accusation of trying to buy forgiveness. Later, as the evening wound down, he found Greer on the restaurant's terrace, taking a moment of quiet after the successful event. "Congratulations," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The Foundation's work is extraordinary." She glanced at him, surprised by the genuine praise. Thank you. It's the most meaningful thing I've done. I know. At her questioning look, he elaborated, I've been following the Foundation's progress. The literacy rates in the pilot schools have improved remarkably. You've been paying attention? Genuine surprise colored her voice. Recently, yes, he admitted. I should have been all along. Silence settled between them, not entirely uncomfortable for once. Your question earlier, he said finally, about whether unintentional harm is better or worse. He paused, gathering thoughts he rarely articulated. I think it's worse. To hurt someone without even being aware of it, that speaks to a fundamental failure of perception, of empathy. Greer turned to him, truly seeing him perhaps for the first time in years. That's surprisingly insightful. Don't sound so shocked, he replied with a hint of self-deprecating humor. Even ice kings have moments of clarity. A genuine smile curved her lips, a small victory that felt more significant than any business deal he'd ever closed. Zora's description. Accurate, wouldn't you say? Until recently. Her expression turned thoughtful. What changed, Marius? Really? He considered deflecting again, but something told him only absolute honesty would reach her now. You did, he said simply. Or rather, my perception of you did. I saw you at that gala. Truly saw you for perhaps the first time, and realized I'd been living with a stranger, a remarkable woman I'd completely failed to know. So it was the physical transformation that caught your attention, she concluded, disappointment evident in her tone. At first, he acknowledged, unwilling to lie, I'm not proud of that, but it's become more. I find myself wanting to know the woman behind the changes, the mind that created this foundation, the heart that still cares enough to try despite years of indifference. Greer studied him, wariness battling with something softer in her expression. And if I don't want to be known by you, if it's too late, the possibility sliced through him with unexpected pain. Then I'll have to accept that, he said quietly, but I hope you'll give me the chance to try. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a message. Glancing at it, she sighed. I need to handle something with the cleanup crew. Wait here. He nodded, watching her walk back inside with a mixture of hope and trepidation. For the first time in his adult life, Marius Prince wasn't in control of a situation's outcome, and the feeling was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. When Greer returned 20 minutes later, fatigue was evident in the set of her shoulders, though her composure remained intact. Ready to go home? He asked. She nodded, following him to where his driver waited with the car. The ride back to Westchester passed in comfortable silence, Greer's eyes drifting closed as the events of the day caught up with her. Arriving home, Marius gently touched her shoulder. We're here. Greer blinked awake, momentarily disoriented. Without thinking, he helped her from the car, his hand supporting her elbow in a gesture that felt both foreign and natural. In the foyer, she turned to him with a tired smile. Thank you for coming tonight. It meant something to the Foundation. To the Foundation, he repeated. Not to you. She hesitated, then offered a small concession. To me as well. Their eyes held for a moment, the air between them charged with possibilities neither had considered before her transformation. Then Greer took a step back, breaking the tentative connection. Good night, Marius. As she climbed the stairs, he called after her, Have dinner with me tomorrow. Just us. She paused, looking back at him with an unreadable expression. Why? Because I'd like to know my wife, he answered simply. Better late than never. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. We'll see. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Marius counted it as progress. For the first time in their marriage, Marius found himself planning a date with his own wife. He spent hours ensuring every detail was perfect, selecting the restaurant himself rather than delegating to his assistant. choosing a private table overlooking Central Park, even arranging for her favorite flowers, information gleaned from Vasquez, who seemed unexpectedly supportive of his efforts. When Greer descended the stairs that evening, he felt his breath catch. She wore a simple black dress that emphasized her toned figure without ostentation, her hair swept up to reveal the elegant line of her neck. "You look beautiful," he said, the compliment genuine rather than perfunctory. "Thank you," she replied, her expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "Where are we going?" "That's a surprise," he answered, offering his arm with uncharacteristic gallantry. To his surprise, she accepted it, her touch light but present as they walked to the waiting car. At the restaurant, conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. Marius found himself genuinely interested in her foundation work, asking questions that revealed his growing respect for her vision. Greer, in turn, showed curiosity about his current business projects, offering insights that reminded him of her own sharp intelligence. "I forget sometimes that you have a law degree," he admitted, as they discussed a regulatory challenge his company faced. "Most people do," she replied with a wry smile, "including me for a while. Why did you never practice?" She traced the rim of her wineglass, considering the question. "At first, it was the grief after my parents died. Then the marriage. Octavia made it clear a prince wife didn't need a career." "And you accepted that?" he asked, genuinely curious. "The woman sitting across from me now doesn't seem like she would." "The woman sitting across from you now didn't exist then?" Greer answered simply. "I was drowning in grief and debt. Your mother offered a life raft and I took it." "At the cost of yourself," he observed quietly. Her eyes met his, surprised by his perception. "Yes." The simple acknowledgement hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. "I'm sorry," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, "for my part in that." Greer studied him, searching for sincerity and seemingly finding it. "Thank you." The evening continued, each revelation building a tentative bridge across 5 years of distance. When they returned home, something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. At her bedroom door, Marius resisted the urge to push for more than this fragile new connection could bear. "Thank you for tonight," he said instead. "It was surprisingly enjoyable," she admitted with a small smile. "High praise indeed," he replied, matching her lighter tone. "Would you consider doing it again?" She tilted her head, considering him with new eyes. "Perhaps." He accepted the ambiguous answer with a nod, knowing he had no right to expect more after years of neglect. "Good night, Greer." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Marius." He looked back, hope rising unbidden in his chest. "Why now?" she asked, the question that had lingered between them for weeks. "Is it just because others suddenly find me desirable? Because I'm not invisible anymore?" The raw vulnerability beneath her question struck him deeply. How many times had she wondered if she was truly unworthy of attention? If her value as a human being was conditional on her appearance or others' approval? "It started there," he admitted, choosing honesty over pride. "I'm not noble enough to claim otherwise, but it's become more." He took a step toward her, close enough to see the wariness in her eyes. "I find myself thinking about you, wondering what you're doing when we're apart, wanting to know your thoughts, your dreams, the parts of yourself you've kept hidden all these years. Wanting isn't the same as deserving," she replied softly. "No," he acknowledged, "it isn't. I haven't earned your trust or your affection, but I'd like the chance to try." For a moment, something softened in her expression, a glimpse of the woman beneath the carefully constructed armor she now wore. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool composure he had come to both admire and regret. "Good night, Marius," she said, stepping into her room and closing the door gently but firmly between them. Alone in the hallway, Marius Prince confronted an unfamiliar emotion, determination not born of ambition or pride, but of genuine desire to earn what he had carelessly discarded for 5 years. His wife's heart. Chapter 5. Breaking Point. 3 months had passed since Greer's transformation began. 3 months of Marius watching his wife become someone new, confident, vibrant, desired by others. 3 months of him trying to reclaim what he'd never truly valued before. Tonight, the tension that had been building between them reached its breaking point. Greer returned home late from a charity event she'd attended alone, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the foyer. She hadn't expected Marius to be waiting in the darkened living room, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. "You're still up," she observed, setting down her clutch. Marius rose from his chair, his eyes taking in the sight of her in the form-fitting black dress that accentuated every curve of her transformed body. "I couldn't sleep." "That's unusual for you." She moved toward the stairs, ready to end what promised to be another strained conversation. "Good night, Marius." "Wait." The command in his voice stopped her. "We need to talk." Greer turned, one eyebrow raised. "About us?" "There is no us," she replied coolly. "There never has been." He closed the distance between them, close enough that she could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You're my wife." "On paper," she countered. "We both know this marriage has been nothing but a contract." "And if I want more?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither had considered until her transformation began. Greer laughed, a bitter, beautiful sound. "Now you want more? After 5 years of nothing?" Something in her tone, the raw hurt beneath the defiance, made Marius wince. "I know I don't deserve a second chance." "You never even took a first chance," she corrected him. "You've looked through me for 5 years, Marius. I was convenient, invisible, undemanding, exactly what you and your mother wanted." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration from a man who prided himself on control. "And now?" "Now, I'm none of those things," she said simply. "And suddenly you're interested." "It's more than interest." His voice dropped, roughened with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I can't stop thinking about you." "You mean you can't stop thinking about this?" She gestured to her body. The curves that hadn't existed 6 months ago, the confidence that made men turn their heads when she entered a room. "You want what others want now. It's not the same as wanting me." Marius stepped closer, backing her against the wall beside the staircase. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself for only seeing you now?" His hands braced against the wall on either side of her, caging her between his body and the polished marble. "But I am seeing you, Greer. Finally." Her heart raced, betraying her outward composure. For 5 years she had yearned for him to look at her like this, with desire, with need. Now that he was, she didn't trust it, couldn't trust it. "Move," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "No." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her neck. "Not until you hear me out." "I've heard everything you have to say." She placed her hands against his chest, intending to push him away, but the solid warmth of him beneath her palms sent an unexpected jolt through her body. "There's nothing left to discuss." "There's everything left," he insisted, one hand moving to cup her face with surprising gentleness. 5 years of silence, 5 years of distance. I want to make up for lost time." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, the intimate gesture sending shivers down her spine. Greer fought against her body's traitorous response, against the part of her that still wanted this man despite years of neglect. "It's too late," she whispered. but the conviction in her voice wavered. Marius heard it. That moment of uncertainty. His eyes darkened as he leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers. Is it? For a heartbeat she wavered, drawn by the magnetic pull of him, by the promise of everything she had once dreamed their marriage could be. Then reality reasserted itself. 5 years of loneliness, of being overlooked in her own home, of crying herself to sleep while he worked late into the night without a thought for her. With renewed determination, she pushed against his chest. Yes, it's too late. She ducked under his arm, heading for the stairs with quickened steps. Marius followed, unwilling to let her go so easily. "Greer!" he called after her, his voice echoing in the grand stairwell. "We're not finished." "Yes, we are," she replied without turning. "Go back to your Scotch, Marius. Go back to the life you've chosen for 5 years, the one that didn't include me as anything more than a convenient accessory." He caught up to her at the top of the stairs, his longer stride easily matching her hurried pace. When she reached for her bedroom door, his hand shot out, preventing her from opening it. "Move!" she demanded, anger finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "No!" His eyes burned with an intensity she'd never seen before. "I'm done letting you walk away from me." "You never cared if I stayed or went before," she shot back, her own anger rising to match his. "You didn't notice me unless you needed a pretty prop for some corporate function." "I notice you now," he growled, crowding her against the door. "I see nothing but you." "Because I'm different now," she argued. "Because I'm not the meek, grateful charity case your mother selected for you." "Because you're you again," he countered, surprising her. "The fire that drew me to you in the first place. It's back. The passion, the intelligence, the refusal to be overlooked. I see you, Greer. Finally." His admission stunned her into momentary silence. He'd never spoken of their first meeting, never given any indication that he'd seen anything in her beyond convenience. Taking advantage of her confusion, Marius leaned closer, his body pressed against hers in a way that made her breath catch. "I want to sleep with you tonight," he confessed, his voice raw with need. Greer laughed, a bitter, beautiful sound. "Now you want me?" she challenged. "After 5 years of nothing?" He stepped closer, caging her between his body and the door. "I was a fool," he admitted. "But I can't ignore this anymore. I need you." The naked honesty in his voice shook her more than the physical proximity. Marius Prince didn't admit weakness, didn't confess need. Ever. "You need what you can't have," she corrected him, fighting against the pull she felt despite her resolve. "It's not about me, it's about the challenge." "It's about you," he insisted, one hand moving to cup her face with surprising tenderness. "Only you." His touch was gentle, at odds with the desperation in his eyes. For 5 years he had barely looked at her, let alone touched her with such reverence. The contrast left her off balance, unsure. "Don't," she whispered, but even to her own ears it sounded unconvincing. "Tell me you feel nothing," he challenged, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "Tell me 5 years of emptiness hasn't left you as hollow as it has me." "You created that emptiness," she reminded him, her voice shaking despite her effort to remain unmoved. "You chose it every day for 5 years." "And I'm choosing something different now," he replied, his lips hovering just above hers. "I'm choosing you, Greer, the real you." The sincerity in his eyes nearly undid her. This was what she had dreamed of during those early months of marriage. Marius looking at her as if she were essential, as if she mattered beyond the convenience she represented. "How do I know this isn't just another game?" she asked, voicing the fear that held her back despite the desire coursing through her body. "How do I know you won't lose interest once the novelty wears off?" "You don't," he admitted, his honesty surprising them both. "You can only decide if I'm worth the risk." His words hung between them, a challenge and a plea wrapped in one. Greer searched his face, looking for the coldness she'd grown accustomed to, the detachment that had characterized their entire marriage. Instead, she found raw vulnerability, something she'd never seen from the controlled, calculating man she'd married. "I can't go back to being invisible," she whispered, a confession of her own. "I won't survive it a second time." "I don't want you to be invisible," he assured her, his hands framing her face with unexpected tenderness. "I want all of you, the strength, the fire, the woman who refuses to fade away, the woman who makes me feel alive for the first time in years." His lips brushed against hers, a question rather than a demand. For a moment, Greer stood frozen, suspended between self-preservation and desire. Then, with a soft sound of surrender, she kissed him back. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses they'd shared at their wedding, at charity galas, at corporate functions where appearances needed to be maintained. This was raw, desperate, 5 years of emptiness channeled into a connection that left them both breathless. Marius's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. Greer's fingers tangled in his hair, her body arching into his with a hunger that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, gasping for breath, the world had shifted on its axis. 5 years of careful distance had shattered in an instant of shared need. "Greer," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. She looked up at him, her defenses crumbling despite her best efforts to maintain them. For 5 years, she had yearned for this, for Marius to see her, to want her, to choose her. Without a word, she reached behind her and opened the bedroom door. Stepping backward into the room, she held his gaze, a silent invitation more powerful than any words could have been. Marius followed, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to seal their fate. In the darkness of her bedroom, a space he had never entered in 5 years of marriage, they rediscovered each other, as if for the first time. His touch was reverent, exploring the new contours of her body with wonder and desire. She guided his hands, showing him where she wanted to be touched, claiming the pleasure she had denied herself for too long. "You're beautiful," he whispered against her skin, tracing the dragon tattoo that curved along her ribs. "How did I not see it before?" "You weren't looking," she answered simply, her hands working at the buttons of his shirt. "I'm looking now," he promised, his eyes never leaving hers as they fell onto the bed together, years of distance dissolving in a tangle of limbs and shared breath. That night, they weren't just two people trapped in a contract. They were lovers, lost in a passion that had been buried for too long. But even as pleasure crested over her in waves, a small voice in the back of Greer's mind whispered a warning. Could she trust this sudden change of heart? Or would morning light bring regret and the return of the cold, distant man she'd been married to for 5 years? Only time would tell if this night was truly a new beginning, or merely a momentary escape from the emptiness that had defined their marriage for far too long. Chapter 6. Morning Light. Dawn filtered through the curtains, bathing Greer's bedroom in soft golden light. She stirred, consciousness returning slowly as the warmth of another body registered against her skin. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind, then memory rushed back. Marius, the confrontation in the hallway, his desperate confession, their night together. She kept her eyes closed, savoring the unfamiliar feeling of his arm draped across her waist, his breath warm against her neck. 5 years of marriage, and this was the first time they had shared a bed through the night. Beside her, Marius awakened, his body tensing slightly as awareness returned. She felt his hesitation, the slight withdrawal of his arm from her waist, and braced herself for rejection. This was the part where reality would reassert itself, where the passion of the night would dissolve in the harsh light of day. "Greer," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. "Are you awake?" She opened her eyes, turning to face him. Yes. His expression was unreadable, grey eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. She waited for him to speak, to establish the tone for whatever came next. He began, then faltered, a rare occurrence for a man who commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence. Last night was a mistake, she supplied, defensive walls reconstructing themselves with practiced efficiency. No, he said quickly, surprising her. Not a mistake, but His gaze dropped, another uncharacteristic display of uncertainty. I stole that moment from you. The admission confused her. What do you mean? Marius sat up, sheets pooling around his waist as he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I pushed you, cornered you, demanded what I had no right to ask for after 5 years of nothing. Understanding dawned as Greer studied him in the morning light. This wasn't the rejection she had feared, but something equally unexpected. Remorse. You didn't force me, she said carefully. I made my choice. After I backed you against a wall, he countered, self-recrimination evident in his tone. After I refused to let you walk away. She sat up as well, pulling the sheet around her body in a gesture that was more about regaining equilibrium than modesty. Why does this bother you now? You've always taken what you wanted without question. Because I don't deserve you, he whispered, the raw honesty in his voice catching her off guard. I never have. 5 years of marriage, and this was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. The composed, calculating Marius Prince she knew had been replaced by a man grappling with emotions he seemed ill-equipped to handle. Why the sudden crisis of conscience, she asked, trying to understand this unexpected shift. He met her gaze directly, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. Because last night meant something to me. Something I didn't expect, something I don't have the right to claim after how I've treated you. The admission hung between them, charged with implications neither had anticipated. Greer studied him, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only genuine remorse. What do you want from me, Marius? She asked finally, cutting to the heart of the matter. A night of passion to satisfy your curiosity. Permission to return to our carefully cultivated distance. What? I want a second chance, he said quietly. A chance to be the husband I should have been from the beginning. She laughed, though there was more sadness than humor in the sound. We never had a first chance. Our marriage was a business arrangement from day one. Financial security for me, a suitable corporate wife for you. It doesn't have to stay that way, he insisted, reaching for her hand, but stopping short of touching her, as if uncertain of his right to do so. We could start over. Try to build something real. The offer was everything she had once dreamed of hearing in those early months of marriage when hope had not yet been extinguished by his consistent indifference. Now it left her wary, suspicious of his motives and the timing of this apparent change of heart. Why now? She challenged. Is it just because I look different? Because other men want me now? Would you be having this epiphany if I hadn't transformed myself? His silence was answer enough. Greer sighed, pushing back the covers and reaching for the robe draped over a nearby chair. That's what I thought. It started there, he admitted, watching as she covered herself. I won't lie about that, but it's become more. Has it? She tied the robe's sash with deliberate movements, rebuilding her composure with each familiar gesture. Or have you simply discovered a new desire to possess what others covet? It's not about possession, he argued, though the flash in his eyes suggested her words had struck close to the truth. It's about seeing you, really seeing you for the first time, "And what exactly do you see, Marius?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "The new body, the confidence, or the woman who's been here all along, invisible to you until she became impossible to ignore?" He rose from the bed, reaching for his discarded pants with a grace that masked the tension radiating from him. "I see a woman I should have appreciated from the beginning. A woman of intelligence and strength who deserved far better than what I offered her." "Pretty words," she acknowledged. "But I don't want words, Marius. I don't want a contract marriage anymore." "What do you want?" he asked, stilling his movements to focus entirely on her. "I want something real," she said firmly. "Not convenience, not obligation, not sudden desire born from jealousy. I want a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine connection. I want a partner who sees me on my worst days, not just when I'm turning heads at charity galas." Her declaration hung between them, a challenge and a line drawn in sand. Marius stood motionless, absorbing her words with uncharacteristic stillness. "Can you offer that?" she pressed when he remained silent. "Or is this just about reclaiming what you think belongs to you?" "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. "I want to. But I don't know if I'm capable of being what you deserve." The vulnerability in his admission caught her off guard. Marius Prince didn't acknowledge weakness or limitation, ever. Yet here he stood, confessing doubt about his own capacity for genuine connection. "At least that's honest," she conceded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "It's more than you've offered in 5 years of marriage." He took a step toward her, careful to maintain enough distance to respect her space. "Last night meant something to me, Greer. More than I expected. More than I know how to process." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I haven't earned that. I'm just asking for a chance to try to become someone worthy of your trust." Greer studied him, searching for the calculation she was accustomed to seeing behind his every move. Instead, she found something unfamiliar, raw sincerity that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "I can't promise anything," she said finally. 5 years of emptiness doesn't disappear with one night of passion or one morning of regret." "I understand," he nodded, acceptance rather than entitlement in his tone. "I'll prove myself through actions, not words." The declaration hung between them, a tentative bridge across the chasm of their past. Greer didn't trust it fully, couldn't after years of practiced indifference, but something in his eyes made her hesitate to dismiss it entirely. "We'll see," she said finally, neither accepting nor rejecting his offer. "Actions, not words." He nodded, understanding the conditional nature of her response. As he gathered the rest of his clothes and prepared to return to his own quarters, Greer watched him with guarded eyes, wondering if this unexpected vulnerability was merely another facet of the complex man she had married, or the first glimpse of something genuine beneath the polished facade. Only time would tell if last night had truly changed anything, or if it was simply a momentary deviation from the emptiness that had defined their marriage for 5 long years. Chapter 7. Proving Ground. In the 2 weeks following their night together, the Prince Mansion witnessed a transformation as dramatic as Greer's physical metamorphosis. Marius, true to his word, let his actions speak louder than any promises. The first change came at breakfast. Rather than taking his coffee in his study as he had for 5 years, he joined Greer in the sunlit breakfast nook, arriving early enough to be seated when she came downstairs. "Good morning," he greeted, setting aside his tablet, another unprecedented gesture from a man who usually worked through meals. "I asked Chef Pascal to prepare those Belgian waffles you mentioned liking." Surprise flickered across Greer's face. "You remembered that?" "I've been paying attention," he replied simply. The pattern continued. Small gestures accumulated, fresh flowers delivered to her foundation office, texts checking if she needed anything while he was in the city, a book on environmental law he'd noticed her reading about left on her nightstand with a simple note. "Thought you might find this interesting." None of the gestures were grandiose or showy. No expensive jewelry, no extravagant displays that might be construed as attempting to buy her affection. Instead, they demonstrated something more valuable: attention, consideration, respect. One evening, Greer returned from a foundation event to find Marius in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up as he arranged takeout containers from her favorite Thai restaurant. "You mentioned having a difficult day," he explained at her questioning look. "I thought you might not feel like going out." She studied him, this unfamiliar version of her husband who remembered her preferences and anticipated her needs. "Thank you," she said simply, setting down her purse and joining him at the island counter. Over green curry and pad thai, they discussed her foundation's latest initiative, a literacy program for children of incarcerated parents. To her surprise, Marius asked thoughtful questions, offering insights that revealed he'd researched the issue. "Why the sudden interest in my work?" she asked directly, never one to dance around difficult questions. "It's important to you," he replied with equal directness. "That makes it important to me." "Since when?" "Since I realized what I've been missing for 5 years." His gaze held hers steadily. "A partnership with a remarkable woman instead of a convenient arrangement with a trophy wife." The honesty in his voice gave her pause. This wasn't the calculated charm he deployed in boardrooms or at social functions. This was something raw and genuine that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "I'm still not sure I trust this change," she admitted, setting down her fork. 5 years of indifference doesn't vanish overnight." "I know," he acknowledged. "I'm not asking for your trust yet, only for the chance to earn it." The humility in his tone was so unlike the arrogant CEO she'd married that Greer found herself momentarily speechless. Who was this man, and what had he done with Marius Prince? Later that week, she received a call from Zora while preparing for a foundation board meeting. "So when were you going to tell me Prince Charming has finally woken up?" her friend demanded without preamble. "What are you talking about?" "I just got off the phone with Donovan at the shelter," Zora explained. "Apparently your husband showed up personally to deliver a substantial donation, specifically earmarked for the literacy program you mentioned wanting to expand." Greer frowned. "He didn't say anything to me about it." "That's the interesting part," Zora continued. "He insisted they not tell you it came from him. Said the program should be evaluated on its merits, not because of his involvement." The revelation stunned Greer. Marius had always treated philanthropy as a public relations exercise, ensuring maximum visibility for every charitable contribution. Anonymous giving wasn't in his playbook. That evening she found him in his study, focused intently on financial reports spread across his desk. "You donated to the shelter's literacy program," she said from the doorway, not bothering with preliminaries. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features before resignation settled in. "Donovan told you." "Zora told me," she corrected. "Why keep it a secret?" Marius set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "Because I didn't want you to think I was trying to buy your approval." He gestured for her to enter. "The program deserves funding regardless of our personal situation." Greer moved into the study, taking a seat across from him. "That's not the answer I expected." "What did you expect?" "Some strategic explanation, a tax advantage, a business connection I wasn't aware of." A sad smile touched his lips. "You really do think the worst of me?" "Can you blame me?" she asked, though without the bitterness that would have colored the question weeks ago. "No," he admitted. "I've given you every reason to be suspicious of my motives." The candidness of his response disarmed her. For 5 years, Marius had never acknowledged fault or error. His willingness to do so now spoke volumes about the change taking place within him. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "The program will help a lot of children." He nodded, not pressing for more, not demanding recognition for his gesture. Another departure from the man she had known. Days later, Vasquez informed Greer that Marius had cancelled his annual trip to the Alpine Economic Summit, a networking event he'd never missed in a decade of business leadership. "May I ask why, Mr. Prince?" she overheard the house manager inquire. "It conflicts with Greer's Foundation Gala," Marius replied simply. "Please ensure my schedule is cleared for that evening." When she confronted him about it later, he seemed genuinely surprised by her concern. "You've attended these summits for years," she pointed out. "They're important for your business connections. And your gala is important to you," he countered. "I can miss one summit." "Why?" she pressed, needing to understand this fundamental shift in priorities. Marius considered her question with unusual thoughtfulness. "Because I'm tired of living parallel lives under the same roof," he said finally. "Because I want to be a real husband, not just a convenient financial arrangement." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. 5 years of marriage, and this was perhaps the most honest conversation they had ever shared. "This change in you," she began carefully, "I still don't understand where it's coming from." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, but not so close as to crowd her. "That night, our night, showed me what I've been missing. Not just physically, though God knows that was revelatory." A hint of heat colored his words. "But the connection. For the first time in 5 years, maybe in my entire life, I felt truly seen by another person. Truly known." "And if that's all it was," she challenged, "one night of passion that will fade like everything else?" "It won't," he said with quiet certainty, "because it wasn't just about desire. It was about recognition. I saw you, truly saw you, as a complete person for the first time, and in doing so I caught a glimpse of the man I could be with you, a better man than I've been." The vulnerability in his admission caught her off guard. Marius Prince didn't expose weakness or uncertainty, ever. Yet here he stood, laying bare insights that clearly discomforted him as much as they surprised her. "I need time," she said finally, "to believe this isn't temporary, to trust that the man standing before me now won't disappear at the first challenge to his carefully controlled world." "Take all the time you need," he replied, no pressure or expectation in his tone. "I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed tested his commitment in ways neither had anticipated. Octavia descended upon the mansion in a fury after seeing paparazzi photos of Marius with his arm draped possessively around Greer's waist at a charity function. "What game are you playing?" his mother demanded during an impromptu dinner visit. "The board is already whispering about your cancelled summit appearance. Now these public displays with her?" She gestured dismissively toward Greer, as if she weren't seated at the same table. 5 years of such treatment had taught Greer to remain silent, to fade into the background during Octavia's tirades. Today she opened her mouth to defend herself, only to be cut off by Marius's response. "Her name is Greer," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "My wife deserves your respect, Mother, even if I was too blind to demand it before." Octavia's eyebrows shot up in shock. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me?" Marius set down his fork with deliberate care. "I will not tolerate you speaking to or about my wife as if she's an inconvenient accessory rather than an equal partner in this marriage." "Equal partner?" Octavia scoffed. We both know why this marriage exists, Marius. Don't pretend it's something it's not. Perhaps it began as convenience, he acknowledged, his gaze shifting to Greer with unexpected warmth. But it's becoming something more, something real. The declaration hung in the air between them, as shocking to Greer as it clearly was to Octavia. 5 years of marriage, and this was the first time Marius had publicly acknowledged her as anything more than a suitable corporate wife. "This is absurd," Octavia declared, rising from her seat. "Whatever midlife crisis you're experiencing, I suggest you handle it more discreetly. The board meeting is next month, and appearances matter." "You're right," Marius agreed, also standing. "Appearances do matter, which is why my wife will be seated beside me at that meeting, as the legal advisor to the Prince Foundation and my partner in all things." Octavia's face flushed with anger. "She has no place in that boardroom." "She has every place wherever I am," Marius replied with finality. "If that's a problem for you or the board, perhaps it's time for new leadership." After Octavia's dramatic departure, Greer turned to Marius with wide eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said simply, "I did. 5 years too late, but better late than never." Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, a distance neither had yet bridged since their one night together, Greer found herself standing outside Marius's door, hesitation warring with newfound courage. Before she could knock, the door opened, revealing Marius in his nightclothes, surprise evident in his expression. "Greer, did you mean what you said to your mother?" she asked without preamble. "About us becoming something real?" His gaze softened, vulnerability replacing his usual controlled facade. "Every word." Without further hesitation, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them with a kiss that held neither the desperate passion of their first night, nor the tentative uncertainty of new beginnings, but something deeper, a conscious choice, a deliberate step toward the future they might build together. As Marius's arms wrapped around her, drawing her into his room and his life in a way 5 years of marriage had never achieved, Greer allowed herself to believe that perhaps some stories could be rewritten after all, even those that began as cold as theirs had. Chapter 8. Second Chances. A month had passed since the confrontation with Octavia. The Prince Mansion, once cold and formal, had gradually transformed into something resembling a home. Marius and Greer now shared not only a bedroom but a life. Conversations over breakfast, evening walks through the estate grounds, and a growing partnership that extended from personal to professional realms. Tonight, Marius had been unusually secretive, asking Greer to meet him in the garden at sunset. She found him waiting by the stone fountain, nervous energy evident in his typically composed demeanor. "What's this about?" she asked, noting the formal suit he wore despite the casual setting. "Us," he replied simply. "Our past and, hopefully, our future." He gestured to a small table set with champagne and her favorite dessert, illuminated by dozens of candles that cast golden light across the garden. 5 years ago, he began as they took their seats, "I made the biggest mistake of my life. Not marrying you, that was the one thing I got right, even if for all the wrong reasons. My mistake was treating our marriage as a business arrangement rather than the precious gift it could have been." Greer's breath caught at the unexpected declaration. "Marius, please," he interrupted gently, "let me say this while I have the courage." She nodded, watching as this new version of her husband, vulnerable, open, sincere, gathered his thoughts. "For 5 years I wasted what could have been extraordinary. I treated you as an accessory rather than a partner. I ignored your brilliance, your kindness, your strength." His voice roughened with emotion. "I didn't see you, Greer. Not really. Not until you forced me to, by becoming impossible to overlook. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "These past weeks have shown me what I've been missing, what we've been missing, a real marriage, a true partnership, and I find myself wanting that more than anything I've ever pursued in my life." Rising from his chair, Marius moved to kneel before her, an unmistakable velvet box in his hand. Greer's eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 5 years ago," he answered, opening the box to reveal a stunning sapphire ring, not the ostentatious diamond he'd given her during their first clinical engagement, but something more personal, more thoughtful. "This reminded me of your eyes in the morning light." Her hand trembled as he held the ring between them. "Greer Lake Prince, I'm asking you to marry me again, not out of obligation or convenience, but out of devotion. Not as a business arrangement, but as a love match. Will you give us, a second chance at the marriage we should have had from the beginning?" Tears gathered in her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at this gesture from the man who had once treated their union as a mere corporate merger. "Why now?" she asked softly. "After all this time?" "Because I love you," he said simply, the words he had never spoken in 5 years of marriage finally crossing his lips. "Not the idea of you, not the convenient wife, but you, fierce, brilliant, unstoppable you, the woman who refused to disappear, the woman who taught me what matters most isn't power or success, but connection." The raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, these were not things the Marius Prince of 6 months ago would have been capable of showing. This was a man transformed, just as she had been. "I need to know this isn't temporary," she whispered, voicing her deepest fear, "that when the novelty wears off, you won't revert to seeing through me again." "I can't promise I'll never fail you," he admitted, "but I can promise I'll never stop seeing you, never stop trying to be worthy of you. The man I was 5 years ago is gone, Greer. You changed him. You changed me." She studied him. This man who had been a stranger, despite sharing her name, her home, her life for 5 years. The cold, calculating businessman was still there, in the sharp lines of his face, the confident set of his shoulders. But something new shone in his eyes. Warmth, humility, genuine devotion. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you again, for real this time." As Marius slid the sapphire ring onto her finger, joining but not replacing the diamond that had symbolized their business arrangement, Greer felt something settle within her, not the resignation she had carried for 5 years, but hope. Hope that some stories, even those with the coldest beginnings, could be rewritten with enough courage and love. The second wedding was planned for the following month, no elaborate society affair like their first, but an intimate celebration with only those who truly mattered. Where their first ceremony had been a performance for business associates and social climbers, this would be a genuine expression of the love that had finally, belatedly, grown between them. "No more pretending," Marius vowed as they planned the details together. "From now on, only truth between us." As Greer curled against him that night, the sapphire catching moonlight from the window, she allowed herself to believe in second chances, in the possibility that 5 cold years could indeed be rewritten into something beautiful. Chapter 9. Renewal. Their first wedding had been a society spectacle. 600 guests, most of whom neither bride nor groom knew personally. St. Patrick's Cathedral decorated with thousands of white roses, a 12-piece orchestra, crystal champagne flutes engraved with the Prince family crest. Octavia micromanaging every detail, while Greer stood silent and compliant, a beautiful prop in a designer gown. Their second wedding could not have been more different. 40 guests gathered in the garden of the Prince estate as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Greer wore a simple silk dress in deep sapphire that matched her engagement ring, her transformed body confident and strong beneath the flowing fabric. Her tattoos were visible and unashamed. The phoenix on her wrist, the cherry blossoms peeking above the neckline, symbols of her rebirth. Marius waited beneath an arch of wildflowers, his expression open and vulnerable in a way the cold businessman of 5 years ago would never have allowed in public. When Greer appeared walking alone down the petal-strewn path, his eyes filled with undisguised emotion. "You look beautiful," he whispered when she reached him, the words genuine rather than perfunctory. "So do you," she replied with a smile that reached her eyes, a rare occurrence during their first years together. Zora stood as Greer's maid of honor, her skepticism about Marius's transformation gradually giving way to cautious approval as she'd witnessed the changes in both of them. Octavia was noticeably absent, having declared the entire affair a ridiculous spectacle when Marius refused her attempts to convert it into another society event. "Better this way," Marius had assured Greer when his mother declined the invitation. "This day is about us, not appearances." Now, as they stood hand in hand before their closest friends, the contrast with their first ceremony could not have been more stark. Where once they had recited formal vows with mechanical precision, now they spoke from the heart, their words unrehearsed and genuine. "5 years ago, I married you for all the wrong reasons," Marius began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I saw you as an arrangement, a necessary component in the life I thought I wanted. I was a fool." He squeezed her hands gently. "The woman standing before me now, fierce, brilliant, unstoppable, is the greatest gift I never deserved. I promise to spend every day seeing you, truly seeing you, and showing you that second chances can last a lifetime." Tears glistened in Greer's eyes as she responded. "For 5 years, I accepted invisibility. I dimmed my light to fit into the spaces you left for me." Her voice strengthened. "But darkness isn't my natural state. I was born to shine, and in reclaiming my light, I somehow illuminated something in you as well." A soft smile curved her lips. "I promise to keep that light burning between us, to challenge you, to partner with you, to love you not for your name or your power, but for the man I've discovered beneath the armor." As they exchanged rings, her sapphire joining the diamond that had once represented obligation, his platinum band replacing the one he'd worn as a symbol of ownership rather than partnership, something shifted in the air around them. This wasn't just a renewal of vows, but a true beginning, the first chapter of a story neither had believed possible 6 months ago. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared. "Again," he added, with a smile that drew laughter from the gathered guests. When Marius kissed her, it wasn't the perfunctory peck of their first wedding, but a declaration, passionate yet tender, witnessed by those who had seen their transformation and celebrated the unlikely love that had blossomed from the coldest of beginnings. The celebration that followed was joyful and intimate, dancing under the stars, champagne flowing freely, genuine laughter echoing across the garden. Where their first reception had been a carefully orchestrated performance, this was a true celebration of connection and second chances. "Happy," Marius murmured against Greer's ear as they swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Yes," she replied simply, the word containing multitudes. "You? More than I knew was possible." His arms tightened around her waist. "And this is just the beginning." The Maldives greeted them with crystal-clear waters and perfect blue skies, their private overwater bungalow offering uninterrupted views of the Indian Ocean stretching to the horizon. "It's breathtaking," Greer said, as they stood on their private deck, the warm breeze tangling her hair. "You're breathtaking," Marius replied, his eyes on her rather than the spectacular scenery. She laughed, the sound free and genuine. Charmer. Truth-teller, he corrected, pulling her into his arms. I'm done with anything less than complete honesty between us. Their honeymoon unfolded in perfect days of sunlit exploration and passionate nights, each discovering new facets of the other in this paradise removed from the pressures and memories of their shared past. They snorkeled among vibrant coral reefs, Marius watching in admiration as Greer's athletic body cut through the water with confident grace. They dined on fresh seafood under the stars, sharing stories of childhoods and dreams neither had bothered to learn during 5 years of marriageable coexistence. They walked hand in hand along pristine beaches, building the foundation of a partnership based on genuine interest rather than convenient arrangement. And in the privacy of their bungalow, they explored each other with the reverence of new lovers and the deepening connection of true partners, passion tempered with tenderness, desire strengthened by growing love. On their final evening, they sat on their deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Marius wrapped his arms around Greer from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I don't want to go back," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "We don't have to," he suggested, only half joking. "We could stay here forever." She turned in his arms, studying his face with newfound ability to read the emotions he had once kept so carefully concealed. "And abandon all our responsibilities? The mighty Marius Prince walking away from his empire? For you?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. In a heartbeat. The simple declaration stole her breath. 6 months ago, nothing had mattered more to him than Prince Global Investments. Now he sat before her, casually suggesting he would leave it all behind for her happiness. "I wouldn't ask you to," she assured him, touched beyond words. "Your work is part of who you are, just as mine is part of me. We don't need to abandon our purposes to preserve this connection." His eyes softened with appreciation for her understanding. "Partners in all things." "Partners in all things," she confirmed, sealing the promise with a kiss that spoke of newfound trust and deepening devotion. As night fell over the Maldives, wrapping their bungalow in star-studded darkness, neither suspected that their partnership had already created something new, a future neither had anticipated when they'd embarked on this journey of rediscovery and second chances. Chapter 10. New Beginnings. 3 weeks after returning from the Maldives, Greer stood in their bathroom, staring at the 3rd pregnancy test she'd taken that morning. Like the 2 before it, a clear plus sign stared back at her. She pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat and toned from months of Dario's punishing workouts. Inside, apparently, new life was forming. A possibility she hadn't considered when she and Marius had reconnected so passionately. The sound of the shower shutting off startled her from her thoughts. Quickly, she gathered the tests, unsure whether to hide them or share her discovery immediately. Before she could decide, Marius emerged, towel wrapped around his waist, water droplets still clinging to his shoulders. He paused when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" 5 months ago, he wouldn't have noticed her distress, wouldn't have looked at her closely enough to see the mixture of shock, fear, and wonder in her eyes. Now, he read her as easily as one of his financial reports. "Not wrong," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just unexpected." His gaze dropped to her hand, where she still clutched the pregnancy tests. Understanding dawned instantly, his eyes widening as they lifted back to her face. "You're pregnant?" The question came out hushed, reverent. Wordlessly, she held out the tests. Marius took them with uncharacteristic hesitation, examining each one as if they contained the secrets of the universe. "How do you feel about this?" he asked finally, setting the tests aside to take her hands in his. The question, so considerate, so focused on her feelings rather than his own reaction, was further evidence of how much had changed between them. Shocked, she admitted. A little scared, but also a smile trembled on her lips. Happy, I think, which surprises me most of all. Happy, he repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. Yes, that's exactly the word. He pulled her gently into his arms, one hand moving to rest reverently against her stomach. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. If you'd told me 6 months ago this would happen, Greer said, leaning into his embrace, I would have thought you were insane. We barely spoke, let alone created life together, he finished, drawing back to look into her eyes. It seems appropriate somehow. We've created a new marriage, a new partnership, now a new family. The appointment with Dr. Chan was scheduled for the following week, both of them too impatient to wait any longer for confirmation. Marius insisted on accompanying Greer, rearranging board meetings and conference calls without a second thought, another sign of his transformed priorities. In the waiting room, surrounded by expectant mothers in various stages of pregnancy, Greer felt a surge of unreality. She had never imagined herself here, had never dared to picture Marius beside her, his hand clasping hers with nervous excitement as they waited to be called. Mrs. Prince? The nurse appeared at the door with a smile. We're ready for you. In the examination room, Dr. Chan greeted them warmly. So, you suspect you're pregnant? 3 positive home tests, Greer confirmed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. And when was your last period? The standard questions continued as Dr. Chan built a preliminary picture of Greer's condition. Throughout, Marius remained attentive, his usual commanding presence softened by genuine concern and interest. Let's confirm with blood work, Dr. Chan said finally, but given your symptoms and the positive home tests, I think it's safe to say congratulations are in order. Now let's take a look with the ultrasound. As Greer lay back on the examination table, Marius positioned himself beside her, his hand finding hers in a gesture that felt both novel and natural. The cool gel on her abdomen made her flinch slightly, drawing a sympathetic squeeze from his fingers. Dr. Chan moved the ultrasound wand with practiced precision, her eyes on the screen as grainy black and white images appeared. For a moment she was silent, concentration evident in her furrowed brow. Is something wrong? Marius asked immediately, tension radiating from him. Not at all, Doctor, Chan replied with a reassuring smile, just confirming what I thought I saw. She turned the screen slightly so they could see it better. There, she said, pointing to a small bean-shaped shadow. That's your baby. Greer's breath caught, emotion welling up unexpectedly at the sight of the tiny life within her. Beside her, Marius seemed equally affected, his usual eloquence abandoned as he stared in wonder at the screen. And there, Dr. Chan continued, moving the wand slightly, is your other baby. Silence fell as her words registered. Other baby, Greer echoed faintly. Dr. Chan nodded, her smile widening. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Prince, you're having twins. Twins, Marius repeated, the word emerging as a whisper. 2 babies. 2 healthy babies from what I can see, Dr. Chan confirmed. It's early yet. You're approximately 8 weeks along, but both embryos appear to be developing normally. The drive home passed in dazed silence, both of them processing the unexpected news. Twins. Not 1 new life, but 2. A double blessing neither had anticipated. Are you overwhelmed? Marius asked as they entered the mansion, his concern evident in the gentle hand he placed at the small of her back. A little, Greer admitted, allowing herself to lean into his support. It's a lot to take in. But you're happy? The question held a vulnerability that still surprised her, coming from the man who had once seemed incapable of emotional uncertainty. She turned to face him fully, studying the face that had been a cold mask for 5 years and now revealed every nuance of hope and fear and love. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm happy. Are you?" Instead of answering immediately, Marius knelt before her, his hands coming to rest reverently on her still flat stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing his forehead against her middle, "for giving me, giving us, a second chance, for not giving up despite 5 years of coldness, for helping me become someone capable of deserving this." Tears pricked at Greer's eyes, unexpected emotion overwhelming her usually composed demeanor. She threaded her fingers through his hair. This powerful man humbled before her in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. "We're having twins," she said softly, the reality of it finally sinking in. "2 babies, Marius." He looked up at her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. 2 perfect symbols of what we've built together, of the love that finally, truly has been reborn between us. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their shared bedroom, Marius's hand rested protectively over her stomach, as if already shielding the 2 tiny lives growing within. "Boys or girls?" he murmured against her hair. Greer was drifting towards sleep, contentment making her eyelids heavy. "Do you think they're boys or girls, or one of each?" She smiled, finding his uncharacteristic curiosity endearing. "Dr. Chan said it's too early to tell." "I know," he acknowledged. "But what do you feel?" Greer considered the question, her hand coming to rest atop his on her abdomen. "Boys," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "2 boys." "Sons," Marius whispered, the word filled with wonder. 2 sons. As sleep claimed them both, Greer's last conscious thought was of how drastically life could change in such a short time. 6 months ago, she had been invisible in her own home, a wife in name only to a man who looked through her rather than at her. Now she lay in his arms, carrying the physical manifestation of their transformed relationship. Not 1 new beginning, but 2. Their story had begun as a cold contract, but in the end, it was becoming the greatest love story of all. Chapter 11. Full Circle. I Want to Sleep With You Tonight. Marius Prince smiled as he read the note Greer had left on his pillow, memories of another night, the night that had changed everything, washing over him. 2 years had passed since those words had first been spoken between them, desperate and raw in a darkened hallway. Now they were a playful invitation between lovers who had discovered that second chances could indeed last a lifetime. He found her in the nursery, watching over their sleeping sons. At 18 months old, Elijah and Ethan were perfect mirror images of each other, dark curls like their father's, amber eyes like their mother's, and personalities already distinct and powerful. "They're finally asleep," Greer whispered as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, both of them gazing down at the twins with undisguised wonder. It took 3 stories and 2 lullabies. "Stubborn," Marius observed with pride, "like their mother." She turned in his arms, the playful spark in her eyes matching the note she'd left him. "I believe the word you're looking for is determined." "Determined, then," he conceded, brushing a kiss against her temple. "Gloriously, beautifully determined." They moved quietly from the nursery to their bedroom, the house settling around them into peaceful evening rhythms that would have been unimaginable in the cold, formal mansion of 3 years ago. Their home had transformed, along with their relationship. Walls that once displayed impersonal art now held family photographs. Rooms once designed to impress, now arranged for comfort and joy. Spaces once kept separate now flowing together, like the life they had built from the ashes of their contract marriage. "Do you ever think about it?" Greer asked as they settled onto the balcony outside their bedroom, the summer night warm around them. "How close we came to missing this." Marius's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of true partners. "More often than I care to admit," he confessed. 5 years wasted, because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me. Not wasted, she corrected gently. Without those years, we wouldn't be who we are now. We might not appreciate what we've found so deeply. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her phoenix tattoo, the first mark of her transformation, now joined by new ink celebrating their sons' births. "When did you become so wise?" "I've always been wise," she teased. "You just weren't listening before." Their laughter mingled in the night air, easy and intimate. So much had changed since that pivotal moment when Greer had decided to reclaim herself. Her career as legal director for both Prince Technologies and her expanded foundation, Marius's more balanced approach to business, their shared commitment to creating a family legacy built on love rather than obligation. Even Octavia had eventually thawed, won over by the undeniable happiness her son had found and the irresistible charm of her grandsons. She still maintained that the transformation had been her idea all along, a fiction they allowed her to preserve while recognizing the truth of their journey. "Remember our first charity gala after the twins were born?" Marius asked, his thumb tracing lazy circles on her palm. "When Harrison Whitmore congratulated me on finally waking up and noticing my extraordinary wife?" "And you agreed with him," Greer recalled, smiling at the memory. The mighty Marius Prince publicly admitting he'd been a fool. "The greatest fool," he acknowledged without hesitation, "but even fools get lucky sometimes." His expression softened as he gazed at her. "And I am the luckiest man alive." The declaration, offered without calculation or agenda, still had the power to catch her breath after all this time. This was the man who had been hiding beneath the cold exterior all along, passionate, devoted, capable of profound love once he allowed himself to feel it. "We should check on the boys," Greer said after a comfortable silence, though neither made a move to rise. "The monitors are on," Marius reminded her, "and Vasquez is down the hall." "Still," she insisted, mother's instinct overriding logic. "Just a quick peek." Hand in hand, they returned to the nursery where their sons slept peacefully, tiny chests rising and falling in perfect synchronicity. In sleep, Elijah and Ethan looked even more identical, though in waking hours their personalities were distinctly their own. Elijah methodical and observant like his father, Ethan vibrant and fearless like his mother. "Perfect," Marius whispered, his arm tightening around Greer's waist. "Absolutely perfect." Later, as they lay tangled together in the afterglow of passion, Greer traced the lines of her husband's face with gentle fingers. The sharp angles remained, but the coldness that had once defined him had long since melted away, replaced by warmth that still surprised those who had known him before. "I found something today," she said, reaching toward the nightstand, while going through old papers for the foundation audit. She handed him a faded envelope, watching as recognition dawned in his eyes. "My letter," he breathed, taking it with reverent hands, "from our first wedding day." The tradition, one of the few personal touches in their original ceremony, had been Greer's suggestion. Each had written a letter to the other, sealed and meant to be opened on their 5th anniversary. Given the state of their marriage at that milestone, the letters had remained forgotten until now. "I never opened mine," she admitted. "It seemed pointless at the time when we barely spoke to each other." And now? He held the envelope containing words she had written to him, when hope still flickered, before years of indifference had extinguished it. "Now, I think I'd like to know what you thought then," she said softly. "And for you to know what I hoped for." Together, they broke the seals on letters written by younger versions of themselves. Greer still raw from her parents' deaths, but determined to build something meaningful. Marius viewing marriage as simply another business milestone, but privately impressed by his bride's quiet dignity. "I hope to be worthy of the strength I see in you," Greer read aloud from Marius's letter, emotion catching in her throat. "Though our beginning is unorthodox, perhaps we might find something genuine between us in time." Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked up at him. "You saw me, even then." "Glimpses," he acknowledged, "but I was too afraid to let myself truly see." He held up her letter to him. "May I?" She nodded, watching as he unfolded the delicate stationery. "I enter this marriage with clear eyes," he read, his voice deepening with emotion as he encountered her younger self's words. "I know you did not choose me, that circumstances rather than love bring us together. But I make you this promise: I will respect the commitment we make today. We'll work to build a partnership of genuine value, and will remain open to whatever future might unfold between us." His hand trembled slightly as he refolded the letter. "You promised me partnership when I offered you nothing but cold convenience. You stayed open to possibility even as I shut you out for 5 years. And here we are," she said simply, gesturing to encompass their shared bed, their sleeping children, the life they had built together. "Exactly where we were always meant to be, just taking a more complicated path to get here." As Marius gathered her close, his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Greer reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 cold years of emptiness, the decision to reclaim herself, his awakening to what had been before him all along, their passionate reconnection and genuine rebirth as partners, lovers, parents. Their story had begun as a cold contract, but in the end it had become the greatest love story of all.